Final audio check for sound levels. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Sorry, let me start again with my mic on this time. Apologies. Good afternoon and welcome everyone to those who are watching the live stream of the Policing Board meeting to receive and question the Chief Constable on the report which he has provided for us. Your report this month, Chief, is focused on the annual crime and performance figures. I did, of course, note your recent comment that the police would be moving from fighting COVID to fighting crime, and we look forward to hearing a bit more about that. There are some notable crime reductions recorded in the latest figures, but these are countered with increases across a number of other areas. Of particular concern is the further increase in domestic abuse incidences and crimes, and we are, of course, at this time mindful of the impact that lockdown has had on this crime type and those who are more vulnerable. So some questions on this and any new trends or issues that you see emerging. Since our last meeting, there have been further relaxation of the rules around COVID-19, and we would welcome an update on operational issues relating to that and policing plans moving forward over the next number of weeks. We have, as a community, seen some pretty irresponsible behaviour in terms of mass gatherings at beaches and parks over recent days, with no social distancing in evidence. And we are, as we all know, not clear of COVID. And the board, we support the messages from ministers that people need to take responsibility for their actions by sticking to the guidelines issued. It goes without saying that any attacks on our officers trying to engage people to follow the executive guidelines are completely unjustified. And I want to especially mention and say thanks to the officer who was attacked in Ballyholme, who stayed on duty and then performed CPR at another incident. I want to thank her and all of her colleagues like her for their dedication to duty and their humility. Our policing service is here to work with the public and is committed to keeping our community safe. We know only too well that policing must be delivered with the consent of the community, and community confidence is built and maintained when policing is representative and meets the highest professional, ethical, and human rights standards. As a board, we have been horrified and joined with others in condemning the murder of George Floyd in the US. We share and understand people's outrage, their desire to show solidarity with Mr. Floyd's family and take a stand against racial discrimination. We've been through a reform program and have an oversight and accountability regime that sets standards that our community can have confidence in. US policing needs similar change and accountability. However, here in Northern Ireland, we also know and by hate crime figures that we do have more work to do in building a society that is free from hate and intolerance. And we all have a part to play in eradicating discrimination and bias of any kind. So, Chief Constable, we take your introductory comments first, which I know are perhaps slightly longer today than usual, and then we have a number of questions to put to you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Chair, and thank you for that commentary and context. It was, with your permission, a chance to maybe say slightly more than normal because of some of the unique circumstances that we're facing, and then allow due time for questions and accountability. And as you said in your introduction, I thought it was prudent to see this today as part of a theme from moving from fighting the virus to fighting crime and how we can evidence what we're doing. In terms of the narrative, which is partly in the report, which obviously will be published, but partly sort of encompassing some of the broader issues that between the two of us respecting our institutional positions we have to wrestle with, I thought it was a chance to quickly update on the crime position, picking up some of the themes you've just mentioned, some of our work to tackle criminality, but then also some contemporary discussion about how we're adjusting our response to COVID, the issue of gatherings, and then at the end, a quick run through some emerging pressures around the budget and the Brexit plan going forwards. I think the crime one is really interesting, and I think it's worth noting for any members of the public that are zooming in, that the narrative in front of you is slightly behind real time. And it's just to clarify to people that that's because of the rules that we have about how we have to present verified figures in the public domain. So that what we'll talk about today largely will reflect the end of the business year at the end of March, but perhaps some of the questions that may come from members will pull us into closer to the here and now. And we don't want to send out mixed messages because of the framework we have to work in. But you'll see that if you take a long-term view, crime has been falling since the start of the current recording regime over the 2 decades. But in the last few years, reflecting the trend in other parts of the UK, that crime levels are rising. You will also be aware, Chair, that we operate sometimes for comparative purposes against a number of similar organisations in GB to help us make sense of what good looks like, and that our crime levels per thousand population still remain at the lower range when you compare the averages in that most similar group, which tends to cover some of the larger conurbations in GB. Quite rightly, you referenced the rise in domestic abuse, and I think that's one of these conundrums of crime fighting and policing that maybe like hate crime as well. What is success? Because sometimes we will worry when crime levels go up, but equally for some personal crime, it's also a reflection of confidence that people will step forward and ask the police for help in times of violence. And I think it's about understanding really what the true level of crime in that space is. But domestic abuse is important in its own right, because clearly at the top end, it results in murder. It can ruin lives and wreck families. And it's one of my personal top priorities in my tenure as chief, but also organisationally something we take really seriously. I think when you see the domestic abuse position that's gone up this year in the figures we presented by 15%, it's also worth remembering if we're looking about making the community as a whole safe and feel safer, roughly 1 in 6 of the crimes reported to us, which now rest at just over 100,000 for the total of the year, are related to that type of behaviour. Similarly, we've seen rises in harassment, which sometimes, again, are related to domestic abuse situations, but also it's not to overlook the fact that one of the things that's driven crime levels up is more enforcement against the misuse of drugs, either through possession or through those that supply drugs to our communities. And that has to be a good thing, although the hidden bounce is that because the way the counting rules work and the way we record it, police enforcement puts pressure into the figures. I think the balance is also not looking at just what we're doing in time to reduce crime, actually, but also our effectiveness of bringing people to book when they've committed crimes. You'll see in the report that broadly over the year that our detection or outcome levels have remained stable, just shy of 1 in 3 crimes are meeting that sort of resolution. And that's pretty strong performance when you consider comparative forces and other parts of GB. One of the things I'm personally pleased about, though, is to see a rise in our outcome rates for domestic violence with injury, which are now over 30% for the first time. I still think there's far more we can do in that space because, as I've said more than once, I think that's the one crime where we know who's done it. We can perhaps make more use of body-worn video and victimless prosecutions to bring the full force of the law to bear on people that prey on individuals in their home. I think the other thing we've been doing in that space to reassure people is where you get that crossover between looking backwards in the here and now is during the COVID period, and we'll hear from probably Alan later about his work as the Gold Commander. We have launched a manhunt for now 200 nearly of our most wanted and dangerous people, and we've arrested 100 of them so far. And the bulk of those actually have been people that we wanted for domestic abuse crime. The other thing that's not fully manifest in the figures and does bring us up to date is that while sometimes we talk about volumes, we're not sort of overlooking our determination to be relentless in our pursuit of organised crime in many sorts of ways. History has told us about the horrible effect that things such as the Essex trafficking investigation can have on lives. But over the last few days, we have seen real momentum in our fight against paramilitary crime through the task force and also organised crime in the general sense. I'm really pleased to be able to update board members that overnight we have seen a really significant seizure of cannabis in a joint operation with the National Crime Agency. Mindful you had Lynn Owens here last month. £12 million we estimate has been recovered and 3 people have been arrested, and that inquiry is quite fast-paced and ongoing. We've also seen in the last few days significant gains in terms of seizing a large cannabis farm, interrupting the flow of cocaine into the south of the country, and also a huge operation with the Revenue and Customs colleagues, which has dented organised crime in the border region when you've seen widely reported seizure of illicit fuel and tobacco. So that's not to say job done, but it reflects some of the determination that Mark and I have and colleagues to keep forward in that front foot approach to tackling organised crime that can harm communities. Clearly, one of the most contemporary issues that you probably expect some commentary on is what we're doing in the COVID space. And as we've said probably in other times, this is almost like policing a moving target. As the restrictions change, as the risk of incidence of disease changes, we've got to try and stay in tempo with that, because Alan's been quite resolute from the start that our approach has been about supporting the health endeavour, about getting a mandate from health colleagues about how our policing style supports suppression of the virus, whilst enabling people to go about as far as they can their daily lives as more restrictions are lifted. One of the things we're now doing is Alan is leading, and I've said more than once, I think he's done a fantastic job as our Gold Commander at wrestling all sorts of things that are in the public domain and behind the scenes. But it's now leading on what we're describing as our recovery plan, so that consistent with rules and guidance around safe workspace, how do we reintroduce people back to daily business? How do we optimize some of the gains that we've made? So, for example, the assets we brought to bear through over 1,200 laptops to enable mobile working, so we continue business behind the scenes. And also a key step forward in terms of how we assure that within the workplace, we're managing a safe space for people to come to work, both balancing our duties to reduce the risk of the virus, but also my duty under health and safety legislation to reduce the risk of exposure to the virus. A key step forwards will be, I'm pleased to announce, the resumption, if you like, of normal service, inverted commas, for neighbourhood policing. We did have to divert some officers away from their normal jobs to support the 12-hour shifts, and particularly the enforcement of travel restrictions at the height of the virus. And after a lot of thought and deliberation, Alan, and I encourage this, has now decided the time is right to put neighbourhood policing, if you like, back to normal, and you'll see that soon. Clearly, there's been a lot of interest in enforcement, which has tended to tail off over recent days and weeks. We've now issued 730 fixed penalty notices for breaches of the restrictions, balanced off against 400 community resolution notices. So we're trying to be proportionate in what we have to remember is our 4 E's approach. It's fair to say, in terms of travel restrictions, that step back to the 3 E's largely. So where we will engage, we'll explain, and we'll encourage. The new sort of kid on the block, as it were, in terms of policing challenges is, as you referenced, Chair, in the start, is clearly how we sensibly police large gatherings within the spirit of restrictions, but also recognising, although today is probably, I'm told, a bit more like business as usual weather for Northern Ireland, but the hot weather and how people have wanted to get outside after a long period of lockdown. There are some practicalities we've had to wrestle with in terms of actually, even in somewhere as clear as Crawfordsburn, what is a sensible and appropriate policing response to dispersing young people there. I myself have seen efforts recently to make sure there's an increased presence on the rail network so that we can support Translic in enforcement of bylaws and safe practice. And obviously, I'm pleased, Chair, that you were able to acknowledge the efforts of an officer who was, as you say, not only injured, stayed at work and then carried out CPR the same night. And I think that's relevant, not just in terms of her determination and all her values in terms of what we see as the best in policing, but you're probably aware that, like yourself, I've issued some comments this morning where we're saying we have been, as an organisation, appalled to see the events of a law enforcement officer in the US and how we couldn't condone behaviour like that. But equally, a message to people that if you need to protest, to do that responsibly. We saw events yesterday in Belfast where there was a large gathering where people are quite rightly concerned, frustrated, all sorts of emotions about how things have played out in the US. But as you say, I'm confident that actually we have, without being complacent, world-beating oversight. We've often advised, ironically, the US about the lessons learned in our journey from many years of experience of policing protest and other problems, about the oversight that this board brings, the Ombudsman, the Department of Justice, and also the public themselves in helping us hold to account. We are, I've seen since my start here, an organisation that does really enshrine the human rights approach in a way I've not seen it's like in any professional sense that I've had in other parts of the UK, and that's something we should be really proud of alongside our work actually to preserve an ethical and values-based approach to policing, and doubtless there'll be some commentary on that later. But policing is a global endeavour, and clearly the events in the US will raise a number of questions about trust and legitimacy going forwards. We have been asked questions about our approach to yesterday, but I think we need to also ask ourselves as a society and a community, what do people want from us and what was an acceptable outcome to yesterday? Because it's easy to get emotive about a response to the restrictions on gatherings, but remembering also that was largely a peaceful protest. There were no arrests made. And so what would be proportionate in terms of our response to then conduct a post-event investigation, or indeed seek to disperse that investigation, that protest, when ironically it was about an outcry in relation to police use of force and brutality. So we had to, as ever, balance a number of competing considerations when we supported the organisers yesterday, who I don't think frankly expected as many people to turn up. We did our dialogue. We were able to sort of facilitate something that it's, we all cherish, that opportunity to cry out when something offends us. And we're going to work with the organisers again in relation to the protest that's now planned for Saturday. Moving forwards, in terms of some of the other things I think are really relevant, aside from this, what will doubtless be an ongoing debate about how we police gatherings of people, not just over the weekend, but we project forwards into July and some of the celebrations we will anticipate to see there. I applaud the comments from the Orange Order about sort of celebrate from your doorstep, but that will maintain that the policing challenge for us, not knowing fully yet how the virus may spread or decline, and also how restrictions will enable normal life and people to go about things that they would traditionally do here. I think there's some things I would encourage further debate on as we step forward, because the Hadfield Bar issue, which has been widely reported in the media, is but one of a number of things that Alan and colleagues have had to deal with in the last 2 months that probably remind us that our licensing laws are probably archaic and not fit for purpose. So I would encourage the debate, which I know is now being held by the Department of Communities, about making sure that licensing laws are enforceable but also keep pace with the modern world. And similarly, I've worked closely with the Ministry of Justice and ACC Mark McEwen and other colleagues across the criminal justice sector to step up the normal pace of the Criminal Justice Board and the oversight of justice, to make sure that during this unique period, we've been able to adapt, we've been able to modernise, speedier, frankly, than we may well have done in other times, some process within the criminal justice space, but I don't want to lose that momentum. And we do realise we have an emerging issue about the amount of backlog of cases where they have not yet had a court appearance. And clearly, whether you're a victim, an individual accused of a crime, or a witness, we need quick resolution to that problem. Finally, before I sort of close for questions, I think it's a nod to two other issues that I think it's worthwhile to pay some due regard to. The first is Brexit. Sometimes, given all the other events we've been wrestling with, it's easy to forget that the clock is ticking. The first thing I'd like to do in that space is offer my thanks to the work that Tim Mayers has been doing, who has, amongst other people, sort of held the ring on this difficult issue for some time. He's held in high regard by other partners, by the sort of intellect and insight he's brought on our behalf to this issue. And obviously, as you're aware, Tim is leaving us shortly to take up a new role in Police Scotland, and we will be appointing a new senior lead in a few days to take forward that issue. But clearly, Brexit needs to remain on our alert list, as we're not fully sure yet the reaction to proposals that have been made by the government. But actually, back to earlier comments, while sometimes we think of protest and officers on the streets, I think we also need to give due regard to the potential here, which is well evidenced in history, of serious and organised crime groups adapting to any differences in the opportunity to make money through tariff changes and the ease of moving goods and other contraband around the country. The final thing I think to alert colleagues to on the board is that it would be remiss of me not to advise you of our concern about emerging pressures in the budget. You'll be aware about the unique way that we are funded here, where we have to annually sort of define a budget within a relatively short period of time and then begin to develop spending plans that mean we have to then spend all that money within realistically a few months, because the way often our procurement processes run. So Mark and I and the team have been wrestling with that challenge. We're mindful of our ambition to grow the organisation, which has to be balanced off against other concerns in the public sector. But we are now concerned that we have already spent in our projections up to £17 million in the year coming forwards in our fight against COVID, and that we're not now assured that all those costs will be recovered. So inevitably, we can see that there will be some expectation that the money we spend, for example, on personal protective equipment to keep officers and staff safe in a whole variety of settings has been well justified. But we've also spent other lines, for example, overtime, which will put some jeopardy to our plans that we've presented previously to you. We estimate at the moment a shortfall of in and around £8 million. And therefore, I've asked Mark to lead some work about where we may have to adjust lines of spend, either in non-pay costs, such as fleet renewal, back office services, which always sometimes is easy to forget actually affects frontline delivery, or indeed the headcount of officers and staff across the organisation, where we may have to suspend or slow down recruitment. So I've gone through quite a lot there, Chair, today with your sort of permission, but I'm conscious as well that members will want to ask myself and the team questions about some of the issues in the report and some wider issues of concern too.
Thank you very much, Chief Constable, for that comprehensive review. As a board, we want to also express our thanks to temporary ACC Mayers as he moves on to Police Scotland. for the work that he's done here and also wish him well for the future. We share your issues around budget and this single year process, which is quite ridiculous, and we will join you in lobbying for multi-year plans and indeed ensuring that we get the priority approach that has been laid down. You have set the bar high in leading by telling us that we're an exemplar of accountability for PSNI. So on that note, and no pressure at all, we're going to pass over to the members who hopefully will demonstrate that in the quality of their questions. We have, for those who are joining us online, we have a number of members who are also have joined us online, and a number of us who are socially distanced within the room. And I'm going to start with the first question from our Vice Chair, Dr. Tom Frawley, who is one of those who is joining us online. So Tom, if you can unmute your mic and ask your question, please.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you very much. And indeed, thank you, Chief Constable, for a very comprehensive report. And in some ways, you've already alluded to the issue that is of concern that I would like to raise with you. Both the Chairman and yourself, Chief Constable, reflected that as a board we're meeting in the shadow of the terrible events in Minneapolis and the US. And you yourself have already alluded in your remarks to the what some might call challenging regime of accountability that the PSNI is subject to. And there are even others who might suggest it's a very onerous regime. I just wondered, would you like to comment in light of the events in Minneapolis, whether you consider that regime now to be a strength or a weakness?
I think, thanks for that, Tom. I think having experienced policing at a senior level in a number of interesting places over my own career, particularly the Met and Manchester, I would say that's not to denigrate oversight because it's contextual and legislative, but actually the oversight that we see here as an individual and a collective, I think nothing is perfect, and there will always be things that pop up left field that cause us concern. But while sometimes it feels like burdensome and a bureaucracy, I really welcome it, because I think some of the things that we've tried to bring as we reform as a top team is about transparency, about calling things as we see them, even if they're not as good as you'd like them to be, and then moving away to build solutions. So I welcome the scrutiny that we see here at the board and in the committees, but also the other checks and balances within the organisation. But I also welcome, Tom, and I know been close to this, as have others. As I said earlier, some of the underpinning assumptions here around the strong sort of value-driven approach to policing, the emphasis on policing with the community, and also how we enshrine the Human Rights Act and the Code of Ethics into what we do. It will never be perfect. We have to use force against people day in and day out. But let's remember, in just one example here, we drew firearms over 250 times last year and didn't discharge them once, which shows some of the de-escalation and prudence in people's training, where we sometimes have to confront people in difficult and violent situations, but then use a whole range of different tactics to keep both the individual, our officers, and the public safe. But I think broadly, accountability at times like this is to be welcomed.
Thank you. Back in the room now to John Blair for the next question, please, John.
Thank you, Chair, and thank the Chief for his report. Mindful of time constraints, just briefly associate myself with the comments made regarding concern on events in the US, and I'll say these three words only: Black Lives Matter. Chair, the Chief Constable and senior team will be mindful of the massive public frustration that is out there amongst those who have obeyed the rules regarding gatherings of young people at beaches in North Down and South Down, demonstrations in the city centre, and apparent organised party activity at tower blocks in the city centre. How do we best address dealing with these issues? How do we meet the expectation of the regulation obeying public who expect there to be penalties and fines if people are deliberately flouting the regulations? And I want to point out as well, Chair, that we're very grateful to the leadership of ICC Todd and the wider policing team for all they have done to address these issues. But it seems there's still some way to go on collaborative working to continue to get the message out there.
Thanks, John. I'll make a couple of quick comments and then probably let Alan develop some of the detail because he's the one that often has to wrestle with these challenges real time. I think what it goes to show, even if you take a shorter window, because your comments seem to largely relate to events over the last 7 days, really, whether it's gatherings on beaches, some of the reporting of sort of wild parties in Belfast, and then the demonstration protest yesterday, that this probably brings into focus some of the dilemmas of policing in a democracy and legitimacy, because one of the cherished as presumptions of policing in the UK is about the notion of consent, but also about the use of officer discretion. And sometimes it's getting that fine line right, because what to one person is strong enforcement and being robust, to other people is aggressive and oppressive, and it's difficult to make these decisions real time. If you go back to Saturday and the beach, what would have been the result that public would have wanted? Was it dispersal, or was it arrest, or was it people not going there in the first place? And these sort of bring into focus some of the dilemmas we get on a daily basis, and played out yesterday, because we didn't anticipate as many people as turned up, neither did the organisers, and we had to adapt to the environment in which we saw things. And there was a good outcome in that people went home, they could protest and have their voice heard. There was obviously some concerns about distancing and but realistically, how do you practically enforce that in a situation like that, unless we start putting cordons in, then escalate things even further. So within the sort of the bounds of what we're trained to do and allowed to do, I think there's some hard choices. But do you want to pick up on any of the other detail on it about what we've done and what we're planning for the weekend?
Thanks, Chief, and thanks, John. Essentially, what you're seeing is a move from what was quite highly regulated space and highly policed space into less regulations, fewer restrictions for the public as a new normal is established, and people are allowed to do more things in more places more of the time. And essentially, as that journey progresses in line with the Northern Ireland Executive Recovery or Pathway to Recovery, then the space for policing and the space for enforcement reduces over time. And if it's to be successful going forward, then peer pressure, and public trust must take the place of what was once a space for policing. That doesn't absolve policing of responsibility in us, but it becomes a smaller part of the solution going forward. And we'll have seen many new practices in terms of discipline and queuing at retail outlets, and people socially distancing in public space. So that is a journey, and it's a journey which we assist in working with a large range of partners, retailers, businesses, and others to maintain going forward. But the actual intervention part of policing is going to decrease over time as we move from fighting the virus to fighting crime, to quote the Chief's phrase. And that will involve public trust. That will require policing confidence from the public in the steps that we take. And we will attempt to try and strike that balance as we go forward, bearing in mind that in sometimes trying to disperse a crowd or a large crowd in any space, in terms of social distancing and in terms of reaction and in terms of infection risk, can actually create the very problem you're trying to solve. That's not an easy space for policing. It's not one we shy away from, but we do need to be very measured in our response going forward.
Thank you. Joanne, can I check? I think your question is in a similar field, so perhaps if you can come in online now. Thanks.
Thank you, Chairman. First of all, I'd like to congratulate the Chief with regard to the PCTF and the enormous successes they've had yet. Chairman, with your indulgence, there's a number of points I want to make to the police and to the Chief before I ask him to comment. Chief, my issues are around gathering and clarity over enforcement of gatherings. On the one hand, we've seen the police being very active in parks and beaches and pubs, for example, down ferries. And on the other hand, we have seen the pumpkin funeral situation, and we've seen the events at City Hall yesterday with waterfall on Saturday. Now, I've had numerous complaints from people right across the city about it, because a number of employees in the City Hall yesterday actually found it difficult to leave their workplace. Their work struggled to leave their workplace. There was zero social distancing. The roads ended up being closed and public transport was disrupted. Now, I note your point about what is a proportionate response and what a good outcome looks like. And I think it is not disproportionate to mingle amongst the crowd and remind them of very clear guidelines that haven't changed with regard to social distancing. And that's all about tone. That's not an aggressive move by the police. It's just, folks, we're just reminding you need to spread out a bit. And that's not aggressive by the police. Nobody's asking for dispersal. We're just asking for the rules to be adhered to. That's the problem, I think. There absolutely must be consistency of application, and there must be seen to be consistency of application. And I'm not clear that the frustration of those who are abiding by the rules is fully understood. There are people who are not meeting up with their families, and they're watching this. There's a huge depth of feeling, and they're seeing action in some places and no action in other places. The guidelines are very clear about the social distancing, and they haven't changed. So people need clarity and they need consistency, because the more they see inaction and lack of enforcement from the police in certain circumstances, then it will create more people disobeying, and it will create a culture of free for all. And I note that earlier on in our Pride meeting, Gerry Kelly did make mention of the 12th of July parades and bonfires. And I would caution that there must be consistency. So we need to be very careful here that there is not, in fact, two-tier policing again, and that message is reinforced, but rather that there's one set of rules and those rules are applicable to everybody. So in light of that, I'd be keen to know, with regard to Saturday, how do you intend to police this and to ensure that the rules are adhered to with regard to social distancing, and that the message is clear and consistent for everybody?
So, okay, thanks, Joanne. Quite a lot then, and might ask Alan to pick up a couple of bits, but I think you quite rightly paint a whole range of competing issues, and indeed, dare I say, paradoxes, Joanne, because we are trying to wrestle with a number of competing article rights and a number of competing bits of legislation, because we all have to try and make sense of both guidelines and actual restrictions, and sometimes the two overlap and come somewhat blurred, and that's actually some of the real-time dilemmas that operational staff have to meet even when they're stopping a car and confronting people in a park, as well as our response to what yesterday was effectively a bit of a spontaneous incident or something that might be judged to be more pre-planned. I think the other thing we have to remember, and I note your comments around the policing of funerals, Joanne, but that also highlights other risks and dilemmas for us that, as Alan knows from having dealt with these over the last few weeks, I think we've now policed 76 funerals in different ways from memory. We do endeavour to have a dialogue with people that are suffering loss or the undertakers and establish some norms and behaviours. And largely that has resulted in success. There have been other occasions where people haven't abided by what we thought was an agreement. And in some cases, we're now following it up with investigation and referrals to the prosecution service if we think offences have been committed. So I understand the sentiment about what you're saying, but I think whilst it's easy to sort of throw down the gauntlet of two-tier policing, which I absolutely understand, that we also have to know your theme was consistency, but we're also dealing with inconsistent events and circumstances. And at the same time, the environment around us is changing and the rules are changing. So I think it's actually quite hard if you're in Alan's shoes to make some firm day-by-day sort of rules for our officers. We've set what we call a gold strategy, which sets out the principles of the policing style and how we manage protest and other things, which gets regularly reviewed in the space of his structure, and indeed was at one point being reviewed regularly by myself and the top team. So I think going forwards to the weekend, we will have dialogue. We're still a couple of days away from Saturday to see if we can set the tone to reflect the word that you quite rightly used, and see if we can give clarity about what we expect to take place. But at the end of the day, some of these events, as we will always say, that the plan will be dynamic and have to be dealt with on the afternoon. But do you want to sort of bring any detail to what we know at the moment, Alan?
Yeah, thanks, Chief. Thanks, Joanne. I mean, clearly, we haven't developed the plans for Saturday yet because we're still exploring the circumstances of that. And clearly, I think for policing and for the organisers, it's a different situation for when you organise an event and you get caught by surprise by the turnout and the size of that gathering. Clearly, what that can happen once, allowing that to happen twice is a different set of circumstances. And engaging in that process to see what success looks like for the organisers is something that we're working full time on today. And then when we see where we are at the end of that process, we'll start and develop a plan tomorrow for any events that may or may not take place on Saturday. And clearly, I wouldn't wish to prejudge any of that at this stage and give a definitive approach to it, other than, we note and share the concerns, the public health concerns that arise out of those events. And we note and absolutely understand, not just as police officers, but as family people and people who have families, some of our parents in care, understand the risks that are associated with this. And we'll seek to bring that understanding to the planning and the approach for the weekend. I would fully accept that through various lenses, policing often gets accused of an inconsistent approach, but that is, as I've said to this board before, an inevitable consequence of what you would ask us to do, which is to police every set of circumstances on its own merits. And where all those different circumstances have differing merits, then you can expect different approaches and outcomes in different spaces at different times. And just to illustrate the point, as a Gold Commander, some of the challenges you do face in this space. Myself and senior colleagues were facing choices on the weekend past about the potential for gathering different beaches and different resorts in the COVID space. But also, if I divert resources to that and the transport network, how do I find the resources to work alongside our colleagues in PCTF about potential high-value drug seizures that protect society in other ways? And so it's quite simply choices to be made around priority and available resource in an environment where, as this board will know, that you just can't throw overtime and money at every problem and expect to solve it every day, because ultimately there's a reckoning around budgetary control that has to be brought back into that. And those are the challenges we face in designing operations on a day-by-day basis, prioritizing what we know based on threat, risk and harm to communities and trying to keep them safe. And I know that the outworkings of that sometimes seems to be an inconsistent approach, but I can tell you that those are very real difficulties that you face trying to bring the principles of what we're trying to achieve to bear.
Okay, thank you.
Chairman, can I follow up just briefly, please?
Yeah, go ahead, Joanne.
Just one question. Can I ask the chief or Alan to respond to those in my community who would suggest that they only place the easy option?
Well, I think it's only fair that I take that challenge on the chin, Joanne, but I would go back to we have to be justified and proportionate, as you know, in our enforcement of both the law and our use of tactics. And I think that's something that is enshrined in our operating procedures, but also in the training and deployment of people in a whole variety of situations. I can't always manage how people choose to interpret things when they see something manifest in the public space, because like other parts of life, you don't always know what was on the desk of a commander or an individual when they called a certain tactic or made certain decisions. And I think all we can try and do is be as open and transparent as we can about the whats and whys and how we communicate what we do to the public so that they can make their own judgments.
Thank you. Moving on to Gerry Kelly back in the room again.
Thank you, Chair. Could I start off, like others, by thanking you for your comments, both on the George Floyd situation and Megan, I think, which was a very important comparison between that and the policewoman who was assaulted a few days ago and then went back to duty. The difference in that policing is very, very obvious, and send my solidarity to the family of George Floyd. I would like to also congratulate you, as you announced earlier on, about the £12 million drugs haul. And I mean, that's a huge move forward. But let me just use that, if I could, and it goes into some of the answers you were given recently. People want to know, and it is about resource, and I understand all of that there, but I get more and more reports of drug houses, of stuff happening on the ground in working class areas, of it being reported to the police, and the frustration that happens there. And this goes back, of course, to policing with the community, as you also mentioned. Can you give some assurance that there will be action? And the reason I'm raising it is because I've seen no action in certain areas in Belfast. where this has been going on for a considerable period of time. It has been reported a number of times. I can understand it's reported once or even reported twice, but it's been reported a number of times, and yet action isn't taken in terms of that, because people need to see that you're taking drugs off the street, in the drugs houses. And could I add to that, just if you have a comment on one of the other things which has become obvious, certainly in Belfast, and what I know about North and West Belfast, is nitrous oxide. Canisters are becoming more and more prevalent. The availability seems to be very, very easy. Is there anything which can be done about this? And it's mostly young people who are doing it. And we understand, I mean, nitrous oxide is the technical name for what is commonly known as laughing gas, but it's very far from a laughing matter, because there are people who are in danger of death. So could you comment on that, please?
Thanks, Gerry and Chair. I think just picking up the last point, certainly you're quite right in saying that in terms of a health risk, which is the first thing, that laughing gas isn't a laughing matter, because people may see, I think it's described as a illegal high. It's been around a good while, actually, in terms of a means. I think the previous labels, hippie crack a few years ago, to give that quick high, but people don't really realise, and sort of advice I've been given, that it can lead to long-term nerve damage as one symptom or effect, and equally it can kill you. But it's also about stressing to people that to supply this is an offence, contrary to the Psychoactive Substance Act. So it was recognised a while ago now about the health risks that laughing gas does provide to us. I think one of the problems is about restricting supply, because it's easy to either buy as shops open, frankly, again, but also through the internet, and it's quite hard to interdict in that space, because it's not actually an offence to possess it. I think the key bit in terms of a solution, Gerry, is about working locally with PCSPs and other key influencers, and as schools perhaps get ready for coming back later in the year, about that education message about the dangers. And it seems to be at the moment, without sounding like a bad pun, it's a bit of a viral effect of behaviour. I saw myself some images on social media, as you said, I think it was in North Belfast about 10 days ago. And it just so happened a week ago, I was on patrol last Thursday evening, actually, in West Belfast, and came across some of the canisters myself in the park where we were patrolling with the neighbourhood team. So it is, I think, the biggest thing we can do is to condemn people are responsible in its use. And certainly from what I'd seen last week and from the reporting I'd seen, without sort of trying to move the blame from the police to anywhere else, this isn't something we can solve in isolation. And the first question I'd be asking is parents letting people out their door, where are they going and what they're taking with them? Because all the people I saw last week that ended up in a bit of cat and mouse game, and for example, the waterworks, were probably under the age of 18. Some were under the influence of alcohol as well as laughing gas, and we saw evidence of other drug misuse. So there's a whole complex range of things where my appeal will be this is also a parenting issue as well as a policing and prevention issue. But it's something I think we can continue a dialogue on as we restore neighbourhood policing to its full effect, working with youth workers to try and dissuade people from what would seem to be a quick hit and a quick high. On the drugs houses question, I absolutely recognise the issue and the frustration sometimes if people want to step forward and pick the phone up either to us directly, or they might give personal information to an officer on patrol or use the Crime Stoppers hotline. That frustration if action doesn't seem to be swift and effective. There are a number of dilemmas there, which, not to say again to try and sort of push the problem away, sometimes that little gem of information is a piece of a longer running jigsaw, and it might be prudent for the investigating officer that the actual strike in that house is part of a wider investigation and will happen later down the line. And the frustration is you can't necessarily tell the person that's provided information. And as you know, obviously Crime Stoppers in itself is anonymous, so there's other blocks. I actually think, though, that again, as we get back to, if you like, full effect neighbourhood policing, and Mark's doing a lot of work, I think it's only today or tomorrow, the neighbourhood policing board is starting again, that these sort of issues, when you get into the jargon and vernacular, all about signal crimes and issues where misbehaviour and crime like this affects the safety and security of small communities. And I think we can do more in terms of the swift turnaround of information, whilst we have to be prudent in our use of powers and we don't escalate other problems when we carry out search warrants. There is probably more we can do to turn around information swiftly to recover illegal drugs from people's homes, and then actually, be it through social media or face-to-face contact, give that feedback to communities. And that's something I know Mark has in his mind as we start to develop a different type of focus on performance in the year ahead. So the challenge will be to keep reminding us of, how important that is, and we need to keep looking to see that information is turned around. We have now introduced a new system across Northern Ireland where we review resourcing each day at threats and encourage a similar, if you like, all system approach in the districts, so that if there is real-time intelligence for us to do something, my challenge is it doesn't necessarily need to be stuck in a remit box. It's get trained people to get the warrant and go for the door and recover the drugs or the other stuff we're looking for. You will also know, though, that one of the checks and balances we've discussed in the past is about the times at which we carry out raids and the effect on communities and young people to get that wrong. So it's a balancing act again, but it's something I think we can demonstrate the value of neighbourhood policing if we're better at taking drugs out of homes and off the streets.
I just come back briefly. I mean, I accept the complexity of this, and I mean, to get £12 million worth of drugs off the street clearly has another impact. But just let me emphasise that in terms of neighbourhood teams, this is what has been, not necessarily through Crime Stoppers, but neighbourhood teams it's been reported to, and they are becoming frustrated by the fact that no action is taken. And sometimes, and actually the worry is, if I could say this, the worry is that in terms of what's happening on the ground, there's always a bigger game to be played. And there needs to be a clear balance, because if it isn't affecting people on the ground, it's not abstract, but in certain ways it's abstract to talk about £12 million worth of drugs, wherever it's found. For somebody in the street where they're watching day in and day out, young people or other people get into houses or cars pulling up at particular houses all the time. So I would emphasise now that that's why action needs to be done on the ground, despite the fact that most the perhaps in crime acts the attitude might be that small beer. We need to see where it goes next.
Okay, thank you for that. Back online, and we have a number of questions from here. First, Dolores, and then Trevor, Colm, and Liz. But Dolores first, please.
Thanks, Chair. Well, my question follows on a bit from Gerry's, and the comments the Chief gave. In relation to the new decade-year approach, there was a commitment given around 7,000 police officers. I think it's very disturbing to hear that, given the budget constraints going forward and the lack of additional funding to meet the COVID emergency, that those recruitment figures are now at risk. I wonder if the Chief could say a wee bit more about any discussions you may have had or commitments from TO or the executive. And also the issue around, I understand there's statement that the Chief Constable of Secretary of State recently, and we're no further forward in any of our Brexit deliberations, and very little insight into how quarantine rules might play out. And also the Chief will know that there was some disquiet publicly around Derry and Strand district, where during the COVID emergency some officers were told that they could work from home. So I wonder if the Chief could give us any update on that investigation.
Thanks, thanks, Dolores. A few quick bits there. Firstly, picking up the Derry and Strabane thing, I know obviously for various reasons a lot of interest, but there is an investigation running into that issue at the moment. So it would be premature to make public comment about that. But as soon as we've got a clear position, even if it's out with the board timetable, we will brief the Chief Executive, the Chair, so the members are updated. Alan might want to come up to speed with the quarantine stuff, but I think basically it's probably suffice to say that there isn't clarity yet, because within the island of Ireland, there's the issue about what happens when you travel. Perhaps you bring in yourself into Dublin Airport and then come north, because we've got to balance legislation there with the common travel area. So we still await finite guidance from the government and the executive about what to do in the quarantine space, mindful, of course, of the role the border force plays as well. In terms of meeting with the Secretary of State, to be fair, yesterday I made some comments, Dolores, about Brexit and projecting forwards, but the main locus of yesterday's meeting was actually about COVID and actually meeting some of the ongoing security challenges in continuing the fight against dissident Republicans and terrorism. So there wasn't a strong sort of locus on Brexit there, aside from acknowledging where we are institutionally in terms of the ongoing negotiations to go to transition. I think you quite might make the point around jeopardy to police officer numbers. The issue is not fully resolved yet, so in fairness, there's still chance that we can make to, in the June budgeting round, make our case to have the books balanced, if you like. I think just for clarity, Dolores, it's we've done two things. Firstly, in this year's budget, we've tried to see how, by managing our resources as prudent as we can to the work that Mark's doing, that we grow the headcount to 7,000 to almost demonstrate to the government, rather than sit on our haunches and say that we believe we've got an evidence base to grow the officer headcount, as has been agreed in the New Deal document and the business case that supported it, that we should do all we can to grow officer numbers before we look to the government to fulfill the rest of the commitment and close the gap. So that what we're saying today is that obviously an unexpected hole in this year's budget has been given to us, could put our efforts to grow from 6,900 to 7,000 in jeopardy. But I don't know if Mark wants to say anything in relation to that, or Alan wants to come in on a quarantine question, or we've said enough.
Sure, just to follow up what the chief says on the money. So obviously COVID was an unexpected bill for all the areas of the public sector. So all areas of the public sector are being asked now to quantify their current spend and their projected spend. And we have been given, some comfort of 8 million for both spend that has occurred and some that we're projecting. But going forward beyond that, we still have more projected spend of around 8 million, and we wait to see what comfort, if anything, we get around that, Chair.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry, can I just come back briefly? Because I attended a meeting yesterday in DOJ, and I understand there is a significant amount of underfunding in the technical paramilitarism and the criminality fund. I just wonder, has there been any discussion by DOJ with yourself, Chief, or the Deputy, in relation to how some of that money might be helpful to police and indeed to work on the ground and tackling criminals?
Well, Dolores, I'm not familiar just with the specifics of that. Happy to talk to you about it. I mean, we in the June monitoring round, we understood that the money that we're expecting from the Paramilitary Credit Task Force Fund for our headcount for the year, we believe is now being confirmed. So that has come forward, but I'm happy to talk to you about that other conversation offline.
Okay, thank you. Trevor, I think some of your questions may be following on from Dolores's, but over to you.
Okay. Well, I couldn't really pick up Dolores. Dolores raised the issue about the police officers in Londonderry who were at home. I couldn't really hear the chief taking that response. So maybe if I could really hear the response to that again. I had a problem with the audio before I would actually ask my question, Chair.
Okay.
Well, if I just deal with that quickly, Trevor, sorry, that there is an ongoing investigation, therefore it would not be prudent to say anything more at the moment. And as I said to Dolores, when we get clarity, we will obviously brief the chair and the chief executive if it's out with the normal meeting structure.
And that will be fed straight out to the board members, Trevor, as well.
Yeah, through yourself, Doug, I
Yeah.
appreciate the answer from Chief Constable. However, I suppose for me, some of this has already been played out in the media, and the police have commented on that. And I think it's given I suppose, concern for some of the officers probably involved in the maybe officers in other stations who are actually involved in the same process. But I've now got a copy of the email that actually was sent, and the Chief Constable's actually named in that, where it actually talks about officers being sent home on a rotational basis. Would the Chief Constable really like to respond to that?
I think, frankly, Trevor, no, because there is an investigation running, and it wouldn't be fair to start to play out decisions that we thought we made against the interests of individuals that may be under investigation. So when we've got clarity about what we're fully dealing with, we will brief the chair, as I say.
And again, for yourself, Chair,
Yeah.
I accept that. But it's not helpful, Chair, where the police decide to play out the media in the first place against those officers who were taking up this practice. I think it's very unfortunate that was the case. The other one, I suppose, that was in the media just at the weekend as well was where the two officers from the one station were asked to come for a random drugs test, but had all their hair shaved from their body, which prevented that. And I'm just wondering, is there going to be an investigation into that and how those officers would have known to prepare themselves in the event of that taking place?
Certainly, I've not seen anything myself there, Trevor, in the media, but I don't know if either Mark or Alan have got
I don't think
any
it would
other
be
detail
appropriate
of that
for
issue.
us to comment, Chair, on the specifics of that or those of that report at the minute.
Trevor, anything else?
Well, for me, I suppose, Chair, this concerns that, I mean, I would support police and everything to do in relation to make sure that the officers are adhering to the no drugs policy. But it's concerning where you have a random test, the two officers seem to be aware they actually have themselves in a position where they can't carry out those tests. So maybe I'm seeking assurance that there's going to be an investigation into that incident and how those officers may have known to have themselves prepared, not to be prepared to actually take part in the test.
Simon?
I think again, we're probably dealing with a number of unknowns and allegations. We have to follow due process, and I think we just need to leave it at that today.
Okay. Well, can we request, as Trevor has, that we get an update as and when you can do that, please? Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
One more, Chairman.
Yeah.
I suppose living in I suppose I'm living amongst many serving police officers, and I think the understanding is many of them have enjoyed the opportunity to work on this new shift pattern, and they do the 4 on, 4 off, and they believe that it helps their work-life balance. And I know operations may be specifically go back to the way that it was prior to that, but is there any opportunity to be, can I actually ask you, Simon, can this be looked at with the view to actually making this the norm as opposed to go back to the old shift pattern?
Yeah, well, again, something in the recovery plan I mentioned earlier, Chair, that I know Alan is looking at in concert with the Police Federation and also business leaders. I know myself, and there's been a lot of commentary about how popular the shift pattern has been, but it has also, because of its application, generated an overtime charge, which we need to stop. But also, this has been a well-rehearsed sort of plea in different contexts over different years about the benefits of 12 hours to the individuals versus the operational need and the desire from communities. I mean, Gerry referenced earlier about swift time feedback in terms of drugs raids. So we haven't discounted it, but I know Alan is now in dialogue as part of his recovery plan and business review.
Okay, thank you very much. Colm, you're next up with your question, please.
Chairman, thank you. Chief Constable, thank you for your report. My question is very touched on it in your introductory remarks around Brexit and the preparation. And can I join you in the tribute spread to the outgoing ICC in terms of MERS of the work that he did, tremendous work he did for that. But just we last met very there's been a significant movement on Brexit, particularly with the publication of the Northern Ireland Protocol by the UK government. And just yesterday, the Bank of England asked the UK banking sector to bolster their no-deal planning. Now, given the very clear and growing risks that you alluded to, not least the situation being exploited by organised crime groups, can I ask where we are in Conservative Northern Ireland and indeed your other government and business partners in planning, and how quickly we can ramp this up, as it looks as though we're going to continue to resist any possibility of a delay in implementation of full Brexit, which does look increasingly like no deal?
Well, there's a lot at the heart of that, isn't there, Colm? So clearly there are some general things in the criminal justice space that there's work going on at the UK level. For example, we've rehearsed about different information sharing risks if we go to no deal, different issues around extradition and arresting people in different jurisdictions. So you've got that side, and then B, the relationships that we seek to have here locally, both with other partners and the UK government, as clarity around the transition moves. We will be appointing a new senior officer to lead in our preparation in concert with government officials, the Northern Ireland office, and also, if we need to, with colleagues in the Garda. So as we get clarity, we can bring that to this meeting to update members. but there's not really a lot more I can say at the moment because we need to find detail before we can assume a different sort of set of planning assumptions and actually what we might need to do in terms of either bolstering checking regimes at the ports if we have to support border force colleagues or indeed the general policing style. So it's early days, albeit the worry is the clock's ticking. So as we know more, we'll be able to brief the board specifically about some of the risks and assumptions, but also our policing proposals.
Okay, Colm, you want to come back?
Just back very quickly on that, Joe. Just to encourage assignments, sort of encourage your partners to move as quickly as possible. It is quite scary. We're only less than 7 months away now and in the middle of another crisis that's taken up a lot of your time and other time within government. But it is something that will come across us very, very quickly. So we will certainly be supportive, and I know other parts of government are involved and will be supportive, but the sooner we move on this, the better. So thanks for that.
Okay, thank you. I have 2 more questions notified. Liz Kimmins online up next, and then in the room here, Tom Buchanan. If there's anyone else who wants to ask, Mervyn noted that, please indicate. Okay, Liz, over to you.
Thanks, Chair, and thanks to Chief Constable for his report there, and just to echo the words of everyone else in relation to the issues. We actually had an update from TransLink yesterday in the Infrastructure Committee in the Assembly who gave us a detailed report on some of the issues they've been dealing with in conjunction with yourselves, and they actually said they had to remove 1,400 people from certain areas. So, you know, it's good work and good joint partnership working there to deal with the issues we're facing. It's just a question, Chief, on your report regarding the outcome rates for domestic abuse, and you had said there that there's been increased outcome rates and that's one of your priorities. So just if you could outline how the PSNI plan to further increase outcome rates in relation to this?
Yeah, thank you, Liz. Firstly, just going back to your comments, I would pay tribute to the support we've had with TransLink. I saw myself firsthand on Friday when we were on an antisocial behaviour patrol, and whilst we've got to sort of finalise the detail, we are looking to set up as a trial a joint public safety team on the transport network, both police officers and revenue protection officials from TransLink. So I think that'll be even in a non-COVID space, a real step forward so people feel safe and secure, particularly on the rail network. You're quite right on the outcome stuff. Particularly, I think sometimes when you get into the detail here, some parts of the domestic abuse picture are difficult to get outcomes if the victim isn't cooperative. And as you can imagine yourself, sometimes if it's pushing and shoving, if it's criminal damage, always come with the purview of domestic abuse, as well as other offences around use of electronic communication. Sometimes it is difficult to bring a prosecution when it's one word against another. But certainly, I think the thing that is unequivocal to me is this notion of domestic violence with injury. In other words, you know, a cut, a broken bone, or a series of very obvious injuries. What we've done, Liz, is begun through what was Paula Hillman's time here, who's moved on to a new role in the Garda, and now Chief Superintendent McNally, is a campaign about when you attend an incident, think charge. So we're trying to put in the mind of operational officers, this is a priority. How do you capture evidence? So it's quick account from the victims. It's about making sure where we can, we recover either first accounts or sort of images from the crime scene on body worn video, so we can present that evidence quickly to the prosecution service to make swifter decisions about charge. We see, in terms of reassurance for you, higher charge rates for domestic violence with injury than other types of crime. So officers are trying, and we also have support from the prosecution service. We have begun a series of work with the prosecution service and Stephen Heron to look at advice clinics so that officers can try and see how they bring forward information. But I think the key bit we can keep doing is looking at the granularity, and actually in the work that Mark will be leading as we rebuild our performance framework post-COVID, is some real detail about what happened at the incident, what was said by the victim to the call taker, how that influenced deployment, how swift that deployment was, what happened at the scene, and then what happened in custody. So we can break this down in real detail to try and encourage, where we can, either changes in behaviour and attitude, or actually share good practice to get more people brought to book for this particular part of the domestic abuse problem.
Okay, thank you. Back in the room, Tom Buchanan. Tom.
Again, the chief has answered some of the issues surrounding the domestic crime issue that I was going to raise, and it was really with regards to the factors and conditions that's ongoing during this crisis within the domestic scene, and how do you then intend to tackle the risk and the dangers and confined domestic enclosures as part of your recovery plan and scaling up of neighbourhood policing?
Thanks, Tom. I think there's a few bits. Firstly, that we've come here and we've said in other places since the start of COVID that what we've seen here is sort of waves of domestic abuse. So the sort of story in GB is about significant rise. We have seen early on some rises in reporting levels, but then at other times we've seen levels actually drop, and it's trying to make sense what lies behind that, because at the moment, I think this week we're actually below normal levels, if you know what I mean, in terms of expected incident rates. We've sadly seen a number of murders, which is quite awful. But again, with the numbers, it's too early to start to determine if that reflects a trend. What we did see early on was some increasing levels of extreme violence, which again was a real worry. But I think one of our things to pay tribute here is not just the efforts of frontline officers and investigators, but also the work of other partners who operate in this space to encourage victims to come forward. We do need now to project out in terms of what will a different environment mean for risk of domestic abuse. So whilst we're all trying to wrestle with some of the consequences of COVID up to now, one of my own worries, which we've discussed internally, is, for example, the effects on crime, and not just domestic abuse, of a depressed economy, of people out of work, which sometimes will generate frustration and other emotions which can result in domestic abuse type crime as a reaction, but also how it actually may fuel a rise in acquisitive crime, which traditionally has been falling. I think in terms of, I touched upon it earlier, but other reassurance to people, we have been trying to support all of those victims that are in what we call the MARAC process, which is a risk assessment regime, which is multi-agency by personal contact from the police to see if they perceive any further risk of crime. And also the manhunts we've been conducting for our most high-risk domestic abuse offenders, where we've now arrested nearly 100 of them. So I think it's fair to say that certainly in my own space and through Mark and Alan, who hold a lot of this, as well as Mark McEwen, we're quite relentless in our determination to do all we can to protect victims and prevent crime in the first place. But where crime has happened, to make sure, as we're speaking to Liz, we use legislation and technology to bring evidence to the PPS where we can.
Yes, Tom. Yeah.
Can I commend the Chief Con on the work that they are doing on this issue? Now, I have one other question, Chair, if you allow me. Chief, last year there was an operation carried out in Londonderry at the Apprentice Boys Parade. And maybe I should declare not this has been a member of the Apprentice Boys, but obviously you're standing over the validity of that operation has been a success, yet there was an independent report carried out, or an independent review carried out, that made 8 recommendations of how this could have been handled in a much, much better way. How can you then describe the operation as a success in light of a report that has made 8 recommendations, and indeed of that report you've refused to date to release the findings of that independent report to the board? Are you of a mind now to release that report to the board?
I'd have to check actually, because I'm not sure it was refusal, because I think there's been an update provided in relation to, Alan's been doing a lot of the work with a different hat on in relation to the 8 recommendations, and that there is a letter I've seen, I think, that puts dates to when we aim to manage the recommendations that were made, which we accepted. It was an independent review by Police Scotland who came in and gave us advice about what we did well and where we could improve. And I think, again, I'm stand to be corrected if there's something I've said in the public space I've forgotten about with the passage of time. But there is, I think, some recognition from the outset that things could have been handled differently on that day, which is why we actually sought to not just review this ourselves, which I know Alan did quite fast time, but actually bring in somebody else with expertise to tell us where we could improve. So if there's something that I've forgotten or we've got confused about, but I think we do have the detail here where I think John has updated, who's in the room, some detail to the, I think to the board about timeframes and what happened, but perhaps we can speak with the chair if there's a need to release further information and something's been lost in translation.
Yeah, John Wadham, the board human rights advisor, did review the case and was fed back through the performance committee. But well, we can review what you're asking about and check the information that's come through. But that's as it stands. Okay, Mervyn, final question.
It's just really a comment and just really a yes or no answer. Given obviously the historical, social, and religious significance of the 12th of July, and it's coming. I welcome the fact that you've met recently with the leadership of the Orange Order, but given a recent comment or correspondence back to a band in my own constituency from the Parades Commission, which did raise some concerns as to the legality of what they actually were doing in that particular case in rejecting the application. Could I just get a confirmation from yourselves that there will be a dialogue with the Parades Commission so that we do not find ourselves in a situation where, as we currently are, there is no regulation that implies or applies social distancing and it's in guidance, and we have found ourselves in a variety of different places as to interpretation, as previously alluded to by my colleague Joanne.
Yeah, I think, at the inference there, moving around two-tier policing, but I'll ask Alan to come in at the end in terms of what he's doing with the Parades Commission as goal commander for forthcoming events. I just think the bit I'd say actually is just 2 quick points. One, where we stand today and where we might be in a few weeks in terms of restrictions is an unknown, isn't it? So that might allow more latitude, hopefully, if the virus continues to reduce and the government lifts restrictions. And also, I think just quickly before Alan comes in, to sort of express our appreciation when Mark and I were to meet with senior people from the Orange Order, where the expectation for the 12th was set out very clearly in a quite responsible way. So that was helpful to then feed back into some of our planning assumptions. But do you want to say anything else about your planning for the 12th, Alan, and the Parades Commission?
Thanks, Chief. Thanks, Mervyn. Happy to talk to the Parades Commission and have offered them the opportunity. Not that it's a space for policing, other than we would generally be asked what the implications are of various approaches, and I would anticipate that will happen this year as well, and be a matter of record going forward. I welcome the responsible approach taken by the institutions across the approach to the 12th celebrations and the July celebrations, the wider July celebrations in a COVID pandemic situation. Of course, I think by in turn, I think it'll be a range of different challenges for policing, because there will be a wish to celebrate and a wish to mark occasions, but outside of the traditional structures and the controls that go with that, and the institutions organising that and bringing their influence to bear on it, then there may be other challenges for policing. We'll be consulting with communities and organisers and likely participants right across the districts in Northern Ireland as we seek to understand what that looks like, and as we seek to understand how we can work together in partnership with others to make sure that the public stays safe during that.
Okay, thank you very much. Just checking, definitely no one else. I've not cut anybody out of the equation here. Looking online, no. Okay. Well, thank you very much to Simon, to Mark, and to Alan for taking our questions today. We've run over time a bit, but we have covered the issue, so appreciate that. The next meeting in public is due to happen in 4 weeks' time on the 2nd of July. And for those who joined us online, we look forward to seeing you again then. Thank you very much.
Thank you.